Hey, second graders. We're back at our drawing of the land of Scape. We've already talked about Four's house, and the last time when we were drawing, we added a whole bunch of details and the trees and things on the roof. I didn't have my windows drawn, but you can see that I've drawn those now. Now we have to talk about the other brothers in our story, and while I'm talking over this, I did the drawing here and now I'm talking over this video. So if my talking doesn't line up exactly with the drawing, forgive me. So we had four of the Ground brothers that lived in the land of Scape, and then the Nazaro was the dangerous line that no one liked to get near or talk about. And the brothers, we already talked about the first brother, Four. Now we need to talk about the next brother. He wasn't the oldest brother or the youngest brother. He was in the middle. So his parents, I guess, thought it would be funny if they named the middle brother Middle, which is kind of weird, but pretty easy to remember. So we can write that on the back, and then we're going to flip this back over, and we're going to start talking about Middle. Um, Middle did not have as much money as Four. He had, well, he wanted to build a house near his brother, Four. So we're going to make this drawing beside Four's house, but a little bit further up from the bottom, if you can see where I'm starting. And the square is going to be a little bit smaller than the ones we used for Four's house. It's going to have a triangle for a roof. And just like on Four's house, we're going to make it a little bit fancier by trying to make it look three-dimensional. So we're going to draw a diagonal line at each of the corners of the square. And then we're going to draw one at the top of the triangle. Now, sometimes, depending on where you're drawing, your line for the roof might go over the Nazaro. If that happens, it's not a big deal. We're going to finish the sides of the house with a straight line, and then we're going to finish the back part of the roof with a diagonal line, just like on the front of the roof. Need to erase a little bit here. Okay, now we have the shape of Four's house. We're going to give him a door so we can get it out of his house if he needs to. And then chimney, just like on Four's house, but we're not going to add any smoke coming out of it because, as you'll learn, this takes place during the summer mostly. And then Middle's house had five windows. So we're going to add 5 windows, and they do not have to be as fancy as Four's windows. They can be if you want to take the time to do that, but they should be a little simpler. So I'm just doing squares, and then I'll put one here in the middle, and that'll make our 5 windows. Now, Middle, his house, as you can see, is a little bit smaller. And there were 2 favorite things that Middle liked to do that have to do with why he built his house here. First one was he loved swimming. He loved to go out in the summertime and swim. If it was warm enough, he was swimming. And the other thing that he loved doing was ice skating in the wintertime. So he built his house right next to a pond. That's why his house is where it is. And this pond allowed him to go swimming anytime it was warm outside. He could go swimming. And then in the winter, when the pond would freeze over, he could go outside, slap on his ice skates, and go skating. He also thought it was a good idea, like his younger brother Four, to put trees around the back of his house so he would not see the Nazaro. So we planted some trees there. We'll add a few of those. Mine went over the Nazaro a little bit, so I'm just erasing those parts. And there we go. We got Middle's house pretty much taken care of. 1 door, 5 windows, got the pond. Now we're going to need to talk about the oldest brother. So we're going to flip over our paper. We've got Four, the youngest. We've got Middle. And then the oldest brother, a lot of kids think, oh, his name must be Old or First or Biggest. But his name is actually Back. So we're going to write B-A-C-K there on the back of our paper. And we're going to start talking about Back, the oldest brother. He was interesting for a couple reasons. One thing you should know before we start talking too much about him is that Back didn't have very much money, but he was good at building things, so he decided he would build his own house, but he couldn't build it very large because he didn't have much money and he was building it kind of all by himself. So we're going to draw a square back here. And your square might touch or go over the Nazaro, which is fine. My roof goes over it, but you can tell it's not nearly as big as Foreign Middle's house. I'm going to draw our diagonal lines from the corner of our square, and then one from the top of the roof. And we're going to connect those with a diagonal line on the roof and a vertical line for the side of the house. So there we have our house. We'll add a little chimney. And Back's house had one door and one little window. Nothing too fancy, really. We'll add the window there. Pretty simple house. Now, the other thing that you need to know about Back, which is probably more interesting than the fact that he didn't have much money, is that he was a really, really good cook. And because he didn't have much money, but he was also a good cook, he decided that he would plant a huge garden. Now, when I draw my garden, I don't worry about drawing every single little detail of the plants that are in the garden, but I draw different types of lines to represent different types of plants. So I've got tall lines for corn, little lines that are kind of bushy for maybe like tomato plants or something like that. You could do shorter, spikier lines for onions and garlic and things like that. You can do round shapes for like cabbages or even melons. You could think about plants that grow on the ground like carrots, so you just see the tops of them, or like herbs and spices. You could have basil or thyme or oregano, things like that. You could have peppers, beans, peas, and each one of those, the line that you would use to draw each one of those is a little bit different. So I'm just going to finish up drawing the different lines here in Back's garden. Fill it up to make sure it's got all sorts of interesting lines in it so people can tell that there are different types of plants. All right, let's see, what else do we have to deal with? I think that's most of the drawing. Now, the Ground Brothers, they did a lot of things together, and our story really starts taking place. Here, I guess before I get started, I'm going to draw another tree. Back had an apple tree that Four gave him, and Four gave him the apple tree so that whenever Four would want like an apple pie or really good applesauce or an apple cake or something like that, apple dumplings, he knew that that Back would be able to make it for him if he had an apple tree right by his house. So Four gave him that apple tree. Now, let's see, what else we have to talk about. We got Back and Middle and Four. And when they, I guess, you can kind of tell they were all together. The houses were pretty close. And in the land of Scape, they didn't have cars to drive to each other's houses. But what they did do is they would walk. Often they would go back and forth to each other's houses. And during this one spring, it was really, 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 really rainy. And so when they would walk to each other's houses, it would get very muddy, and they would have to trudge through mud. And even if they tried to walk a different direction, if they walked that way for too long, back and forth, it would get muddy. And they got really frustrated by this, and they realized that they needed to figure out a solution to this mud problem. And this was all happening, in April. It was rainy, and when it got to May and the rain sort of stopped a little bit, they decided they would build a sidewalk, basically. I don't know if they called it a sidewalk, but that's pretty much what it was. And it was a really hard trail. It may have been made out of stone or concrete or something. that went to each of their houses. So it went from Back's house to Middle's house to Four's two front doors. And this allowed them to walk back and forth to each other's houses much, 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 much quicker. And it wouldn't be muddy. They wouldn't trip and fall and slide around in the mud and get all messed up. And they also found out it was a lot easier to walk around. In the winter time, it was easier to like shovel the snow off the sidewalk. They hadn't really thought about it before, but when they realized they could shovel snow off of it, it made it a lot easier to get around. Okay, now this is kind of where the story starts. So this, after May, when they put in the sidewalk, they started going to each other's houses all the time. They would go to Back's house for all their dinners, and actually even breakfast and lunch. A lot of times they would go to Back's house. And then once it started getting warmer in June, they would go to Middle's house often to go swimming. If it was ever rainy or anything, they would go to Four's house and go inside and do things in there. They ever had parties, things like that, they would go to Four's house also. And because of all the spring rains, Back's garden was growing like crazy. And they decided that, Back would make a big meal every night from his garden. And they would go there and they would get stuffed. They would eat so much food. And the food that they ate, like they would try to eat everything, and they would get stuffed, and they would lay down in the grass beside the garden and just relax and wait until the sun would go down and look at the stars. It was like one of their favorite things to do. And they did this pretty much every night. They would eat a ton of food. They'd go lay down beside the garden. They'd wait for the sun to go down and, just look at the stars and relax and, have a good time. And they noticed one day, like in the middle of June, the sun went down and they started hearing these like strange noises that they'd never heard before. And they didn't think much about it. They thought it was the neighbors or something. And then the next night, the same thing happened. They went out and they laid down, and the sun went down, and they started hearing these weird noises again. It was a little bit louder than it had been the day before, but again, it wasn't anything like, it didn't sound like it was real close to them or anything, so they didn't really worry about it too much. And then that happened every night for about a week, until one night, Middle realized that those noises that they were hearing were coming from the Spooky Mountains, which we haven't really talked about yet. But they were called the Spooky Mountains because the mountains kind of look like shark teeth. And people thought they looked kind of spooky, I guess. And no one in the land of Scape had ever been there. And when the brothers realized that's where the sound was coming from, they got actually a little bit nervous because no one in the land of Scape had ever been past the Nazaro, and definitely no one had ever been to the Spooky Mountains. They were far too dangerous for anyone to ever go there. So this kind of scared the brothers a little bit, and they realized that they might have a problem on their hands. And the sound every night kept getting louder and louder and louder. And some nights they'd go into Back's house. When the sun would go down, they'd go into Back's house to get away from the noises. Sometimes they'd go into Middle's house if the noises were really loud. And on nights when there was a full moon, they would have to go into Four's house and go all the way in the basement just to get away from all the noise. And it was actually pretty frightening to them. And then one night, I think it was in end of July sometime, the sun was about to go down, and Middle and Four stood up and started to go into Back's house. And Back said, "Wait, I'm tired of running away from these noises. I'm going to go find out what these sounds are." And Middle and Four were like, "Brother, you're crazy. We can't do that. No one's ever been there. That's too dangerous. Come on, let's go to bed." And Back said, "No way, I'm going." And so he started packing up a whole bunch of stuff in his backpack to get ready for this trip that he was going to take to find out what these noises were. And Middle and Four thought, no. We're going to go with you. This is too dangerous. You can't do this by yourself. So Middle went to his house. packed up, I think, some sleeping bags or something like that. And then 4 went to his house and grabbed a really nice tent that he had, grabbed a few other supplies, and they got ready to start walking. And that's where we have to stop for today. Next week, I'm going to tell you the rest of this story. But for now, you can work on this drawing, get it finished. You do not have to turn in this drawing until we get it completely finished. So some of you turned this in, what you had done last week, and you sent me a picture of that, which is great. But you don't need to send me a picture in of what you did this week. I mean, you can if you want to, but you don't really have to. Next week, we're going to finish the story. And while I'm finishing the story, we're also going to be coloring this. So you can actually color at the same time you're listening to me tell the story, because there's not that much that we have to draw that's left over. So finish this drawing, and then next week we will we'll finish up the rest. Hope you had a good time drawing this, and